Have you ever witnessed someone making a bad decision which you knew would have profound consequences for their life? Maybe it was in the realm of finances. They got involved with someone really shady and invested a chunk of their savings into a scheme they're convinced was going to guarantee a big payout. Or perhaps it was in the area of relationships. A girl starts to go out with a guy that everyone else can see as bad news, or vice versa, but she's convinced that they've all got him wrong. Or maybe it's in the area of work. Perhaps you've seen someone with a good job which they're doing well at, but suddenly on a whim they decide to give it up and do something else that they're clearly not cut out for. Perhaps it wasn't your place to try and intervene. Or maybe you did speak to them, but they just weren't for listening. And all you can do is watch on as the whole thing falls apart and hope that you can help them pick up the pieces when they finally come to their senses. Well, in this chapter, we watch on as someone makes a series of bad decisions. It's a bit like watching a car crash in slow motion. We can see it unfolding before our eyes, but we can't do anything about it. The chapter makes a clear contrast between the faithful choices of Abraham and the faithless choices of Lot. Abraham wasn't always faithful to God. We saw that last week. But in this chapter, he is an example of living by faith, whereas Lot is an example of living by sight. And we're told that in the New Testament to live by faith and not by sight. And here in the Old Testament, we're given an example of each of those things. As I say, all we can really do is watch on here as Lot makes his bad decisions. But that doesn't mean this chapter is not relevant to us, because it's here to challenge us about the sort of choices we are making and the reasons behind those choices. And we can't escape the weight of this chapter. In some ways, it would be more comforting if we could say, well, Lot wasn't a believer. Abraham shows us the types of choices that a believer makes, and Lot shows us the types of choices that an unbeliever makes. But it isn't that simple, because we know from the New Testament that Lot was a believer too. Now, there's nothing in this chapter that would suggest that, and not really much in the chapters that follow as well. I find it one of the most eyebrow-raising statements in the New Testament, really, how the Apostle Peter describes Lot in 2 Peter 2:7. But he must know more than we do. He says that Lot was righteous and eventually, at least, was distressed by the lives of the unbelievers around him. But they're both believers, and the chapter tells you that you could be a Christian and make disastrous decisions. It tells us that you could be a Christian, but people could never guess that from the decisions that you make. And if we include what we learn in later chapters about Lot's wife and daughters, it tells us that you can be a Christian and make it to heaven in the end, but also bring spiritual harm on those closest to you. So this is a challenging chapter, but God's purpose here isn't simply to warn us away from making bad decisions. It's to encourage us to make good decisions and encourage us, if we have made good decisions, but it doesn't seem that there's much benefit coming from them. But particularly relevant for you children as you grow up and make those sort of big life choices as to where to live, what you'll do, who you'll marry, but it's relevant to us all. And as I say, if like Abraham, you have made hard decisions in the past, but are tempted to think, well, it was pointless, the chapter encourages you to keep going, knowing that God is faithful, and in the end, your faithful choices will be seen as the best decisions you could have made. We have two simple headings tonight. Firstly, looking at Lot's faithless choice, and then secondly, Abraham's faithful choice. But we'll spend most of our time on the first one. So firstly, Lot's faithless choice. Being poor has temptations, but so does being rich. In Proverbs 30, we have the prayer of someone who says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches." Why? Well, he goes on to explain that if he has everything he needs, he'll run the risk of denying God, forgetting about God. But on the other hand, if he's poor, he says he'll be tempted to steal and so dishonor God that way. Well, in the last chapter, Abraham faced the temptation of poverty as famine came on the land. How would he react? And he makes a probably at least dubious choice to leave and go to Egypt. But here he faces the temptation of riches, as does his nephew Lot. Verse 6 tells us that Lot, who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the problem is that the land couldn't support both of them dwelling together because their possessions were so many. And their workers started to have conflict with each other. Yes, this is the land that God has promised Abraham. He's going to give them the land, but there are other people still dwelling in the land. At the end of verse 7, the Canaanites and Perizzites at that time were dwelling in the land. And Abraham says to his nephew, "We can't go on like this." And isn't that a great attitude for a believer? If there's friction between another believer, we can't go on like this. Look, he says, the whole land is in front of you. You choose which part you want, and I'll take the part that you don't. If you go one way, I'll go the other. It's an incredibly magnanimous thing for Abraham to do. Abraham was the oldest of the two of them. He was clearly the leader. He was the one who had been promised the land by God. But rather than pull rank and say, "This is what's happening," he simply turns to his nephew and says, "You choose." Remember, these men depended on the land for their survival. It wasn't simply a case of choosing a nicer neighborhood over a not-so-nice one. It was a decision that would have very real consequences for their future. And we'll come back later to ask the question, what was it that gave Abraham the freedom to make the choice that he made? But for now, we're focusing on Lot's choice. Verse 10 tells us that Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered like the garden of the Lord. In other words, like the Garden of Eden. It looked like paradise. And yet those words at the start of verse 10 highlight the problem. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw. In other words, he's living by sight, not by faith. He's judging based on what he sees. But those words are also ironic because Lot doesn't actually see the whole picture. His thinking was too short-term. In verse 12, he moved his tent as far as Sodom, no doubt aware of how wicked the residents of Sodom were, as verse 13 tells us. It wouldn't have been a surprise. And yet he doesn't seem to be able to see the inevitable consequences of going there. And in making that choice, Lot isn't just making a geographical journey, but a spiritual journey. If we had read Genesis from the beginning tonight, the end of verse 11 would have sounded particularly ominous. Lot journeyed east. What's the big deal about that? Well, so far in Genesis, whenever someone has journeyed east, it's been a move away from God. This is now the third time we've seen that pattern. Firstly, Cain built a city east of Eden. Then those who built the Tower of Babel did so after moving east from Noah's Ark. And now Lot moves east with a plan to establish a new and prosperous life for him and his family. It's always a good question to ask. Am I moving closer to God or further from God? And be encouraged if you tonight are closer to God than you were even a year ago. But each time in Genesis a group moves east, it's to try and establish a city for themselves away from the presence of God. They move to try and establish their own version of paradise without God being involved. And in each case, it's a move towards a city which is doomed for destruction. And those doomed cities also appear at significant times. Cain built his city soon after the beginning of the world. Then the Tower of Babel was built at the beginning of the new world after the flood. And now Lot moves towards Sodom at the very beginnings of the nation of Israel, where it would stem from. And one of the things this tells us is that whatever point of time in which you live, there will always be two options. There will always be two kingdoms calling for your loyalty and devotion. You can live for the city of God and His kingdom, or you can live for the city of man. And the choices that we make in life will tend to show which one we're living for. That's the thing about our choices. They reveal what's in our hearts. They show what's important to us. I think of the young person who moves away from home to start university. The first Sunday there, will they get up and go to church? If they don't, the problem isn't so much that they didn't go to church. The problem is that despite all their privileges, they have a heart that doesn't want to go. Our choices show what's important to us. But what is it about Lot's choice that's so wrong? Well, for a start, he doesn't seek God's will. Verse 11, so Lot chose for himself. He's doing what he thinks best for his immediate prosperity without any thought of God. And in case you think it's reading too much into it, when Lot makes his move, we don't read anything about him building altars like Abraham does, both at the start and end of the chapter. The worship of God isn't a priority for Lot. Someone has said that Lot was the kind of man who would certainly choose heaven over hell if given the choice, but not heaven over earth. Material prosperity was what really counted for him. And if the alarm bells aren't ringing when we see Lot having no involvement for God in the decision, surely they are by the time we reach verse 12. That Lot moved his tent as far as Sodom. And you don't need to know much about the Bible to know that Sodom was one of the wickedest cities that ever existed. Though also Jesus said to the sort of places that we were thinking about this morning, places where he went and preached and the people still rejected him, that they would actually be more guilty on the day of judgment than Sodom would be. Now there are, of course, Christians who end up living places they would rather not, but Lot has the whole land to choose from, and this is where he chooses to go, right to the very border of Sodom itself. Lot's the sort of Christian who wants to push things as close to the line as possible and still be able to turn around and say, well, I didn't actually do anything wrong. I'm not living in Sodom. How much can I get away with? Was the sort of question he would ask. But he's playing with fire, which tends to lead to getting burned. And we'll see that in the next few chapters. Lot gets sucked in. If you look over to chapter 14, verse 12, you'll see that by that point Lot was actually dwelling in Sodom. And by the start of chapter 19, he's sitting in the gate of Sodom, which implies that he was part of the city's ruling council. He's got sucked in. I'm sure at the start of the story he would never have imagined living in Sodom, but he's been pushing the limits, and that's where he ends up. And even once he's in Sodom, he's probably convinced himself that he can handle it. Even at this point, he probably can't imagine how his life will turn out. But we'll see the sad consequences of his actions over the next few weeks. We know from this chapter that it's bad, but if you're not familiar with the next few chapters, I think it would be hard to even guess at this point just how bad things will get. This decision that Lot has made, in the name of short-term prosperity, will have dreadful long-term consequences. And remember, he's doing this as a believer, as a Christian, and yet he's pressing the self-destruct button on his life and his children's lives. Do you have Christians that you can talk to before making major life decisions? Do you have people in your life who will say to you, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" And do you give them the opportunity to say that? Boys and girls, one of the first verses I remember learning was Proverbs 3, verse 5. And be quite interested, sometimes you would see someone's Bible and they would have that written on one of the first pages of the Bible. Proverbs 3, verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Well, what if we don't trust in God with all our heart? What if we do lean on our own understanding? Well, Lot shows us what can happen. We're thinking this morning about the importance of church, and it's another reason why God in his wisdom places us in communities where we can seek the wisdom of others. So that when an apparently great opportunity comes along, someone might ask you, well, wait a minute, what will that do to your marriage? Will that disrupt your ability to be present at the worship of God? As Jesus put it, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Well, Lot may not have forfeited his soul, but he forfeited an awful lot. So firstly, tonight, Lot's faithless choice, but then secondly, and more briefly, Abraham's faithful choice. Abraham's faithful choice. Now, in a sense, Abraham didn't choose what part of the land to settle in. He simply had to take whatever was left. His choice was to let Lot choose. His choice was to let Lot choose. It's a huge thing to do. And so what was it that made him able to make that choice? Or for that matter, what was it that allowed C.T. Studd to give away a huge fortune and go as a missionary to China? C.T. Studd, whose name was on the first Ashes trophy. What is it today that allows Christians to take a financial hit and turn down attractive job offers that would take them away from regular involvement in a healthy gospel-preaching church? What is it that allows Christians to joyfully give to God's work rather than hold on to every penny? Well, the answer is the promises of God. Christians are able to give up their rights in order to bless others because they're trusting God's promises that he will provide. Abraham is secure in God and in God's promises, and so he can give up the land, knowing that God has promised it to his descendants, and even if it means a harder life in the meantime, he can leave it with God, trusting that God will do what he says. When we are secure in Christ, we don't have to grasp greedily for possessions. In this chapter, both Lot and Abraham lift up their eyes and see, but Lot looks by sight, Abraham looks by faith. Lot looks out to see where he can prosper most quickly. Abraham looks out by faith, knowing that one day God will give him the land anyway, so there's no point pushing and scrambling for it. People tend to be pushy because all they can see is the here and now. It's all they have as far as they're concerned. All they can see is this world, but the Christian can see longer term. We know how the story ends. And so we don't need to be pushy, always claiming our rights. So, Abraham surely had the right to choose which part of the land, but he didn't claim that right. In the grand scheme of things, the here and now is so fleeting and temporary that it's not worth getting so worked up about. Lot judges by appearances, and Abraham acts in faith. And yet it's not as if they had to wait until eternity to see who made the wisest choices. What's the situation here in verse 13? Well, Abraham has a promise from God, but a wife unable to have children. Whereas Lot is living next door to this hugely prosperous city of Sodom. And yet within a few short years, the once well-watered Sodom is turned into an ash heap. Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt, while Abraham's wife is giving birth to a son. Now, sometimes eternity alone will reveal whether our choices were wise or foolish, but you don't usually have to wait that long. To give a simple example, think of the parent who lets their kids do whatever they want, whereas another parent goes through the harder process of disciplining them. Letting your kids do whatever they want in the name of short-term peace is such a short-sighted thing to do, because within a few years there'll be no working with them. The wisdom or foolishness of our choices doesn't always become clear immediately, but it will often become clear even in this life. But even if it doesn't, even if it looks to all the world, maybe even to ourselves, that we've given up financial security or career prospects or whatever for no reason, if we've done it out of obedience to God and for the sake of His kingdom, then we can trust Him that eternity will reveal that we've made the right choice. But that's easier said than done. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't making the big decision for God, it's the immediate doubts that come afterwards. Have I done the right thing? Have I just thrown away an easier life for nothing? I've tried to make the decision based on family and church, but it doesn't seem to be having much impact. It's not hard to imagine Abraham, after Lot separates from him, thinking, what have I done? Yeah, it was a nice thing to do, but what good has it done me? But God is so kind and gracious, isn't He? Because in verse 14, He appears to Abraham to reassure him. He didn't have to, but He does, because that's the sort of God He is. He says to Abraham, lift up your eyes, not to see the fading glitz and glamour of Sodom, but lift up your eyes to see what I will one day give to you and your offspring. Then He tells him to walk the length and breadth of the land. That's something that kings would have done in ancient times. It was a ceremony that showed their ownership of the whole land. And as Abraham does it, God is saying to him, every blade of grass you stand on will belong to you and your children. Every square foot you can see will belong to you. And we can look at our world really the same way. We maybe see a house online and think, well, we'll never have a house like that. And yet, God is going to give the new earth to His people. We will live forever in the new heavens and the new earth as our inheritance. And God is saying here, take heart, Abraham. Don't worry about Lot and his earthly prospects increasing. You made the choice because you believed in my promise. And I'm reconfirming that promise. In fact, God even intensifies it and amplifies the promise here. Previously, God had promised Abraham that He would make him into a great nation. But now He's promising that his descendants would be like the dust of the earth. There'd be so many of them. Perhaps you've made hard choices for God. Financial choices, relational choices, choices about where to live or work. And you've made those decisions in faith and in light of God's word, but maybe you doubt at times whether it was worth it. Well, God is speaking to you tonight, and He's reassuring you that, like Abraham, you haven't chosen to follow Him in vain. And even if it looks like a foolish choice now, one day your choice will be vindicated. And until then, keep trusting in Him. And ultimately, as we close tonight, Abraham's faithful choice points us beyond him to Jesus. Why did Abraham make his choice? Because he knew that long term he would have it all and more. We could say for the joy set before him. Why did Jesus go to the cross? Why was he able to despise its shame? For the joy set before him. Jesus too, we could say, was tempted over land, as we thought about last week. The devil taking him up to the high mountain, showing him all the kingdoms of the world, and says, you can have it all if you worship me. Jesus replied, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. That was Abraham's choice too. Like Jesus, he saw the bigger picture. And like Jesus, he kept God in first place, no matter what those around him were doing. So as we finish tonight, the message isn't just, well, be like Abraham, don't be like Lot. That's part of it. But often we have been more Lot-like in our choices than we might like to admit. And so our hope tonight is in the one greater than Abraham, who was offered far more riches, but chose to go through far more suffering, so that we could be forgiven for our faithless choices, and that by his grace we might choose life and trust in him. Amen. We'll close with Psalm 31. Psalm 31 at verse 14, page 57. Psalm 31, verses 14 to 17. Page 57. Whatever others say or do, we can say like Jesus, but as for me, O Lord, in you I trust. At the start of verse 14. We are free to make what might seem radical decisions for Jesus, because we know in the words of verse 15 that our times are in his hands. Abraham knew that, and we can know it. And we can have the confidence in verse 17 that in light of eternity, we will not be ashamed of the choices we've made for him. So verses 14 through 17 on page 57, tune number 67, tune Contemplation 67. If you're able, we'll stand as we sing praise.